Dimitris, thank you, the comrades of the Marxist Workers League that organized this very important and actual meeting. And I will complement from the Greek vantage point the excellent report already given by Comrade Sungur. And it is important also to mention here that while the chauvinists from both sides of the Aegean try to create conditions of a slaughter, a fratricide slaughter between the Greek and Turkish people, our common presence here as a members also of the International Socialist Center, Christian Rakowski, is a demonstration of internationalism, which is the only answer to the challenges and the dangers that humanity faces today. In Greece today, May 21st, it is an election day. And the principal contenders for the government power are the right-wing New Democracy under Kyriakos Mitsotakis from one side, and the other side, the center-left Syriza under Alexis Tsipras, previous presenting itself as a radical left party. Now, not only their role, programs, and practices are faithfully serving the bankrupt capitalist system of our country, but also adding insult to injury, both remain servile supporters of NATO. Despite all the disasters that NATO accumulated in our country and in the Greek people, including the military dictatorship of 1967-74, as well the tragedy in Cyprus, already both mentioned by Sungur, and I will talk about it later. Unsurprisingly, both parties, right wing and center left, New Democracy and Syriza in Greece, they voted for Finland and Sweden to join NATO. And it is not a surprise, of course, that particularly Greece is an integral part of what rightly was described before by Comrade Sungur as the NATO proxy war at the heart of Europe in Ukraine. Greece became a member of the NATO war machine from the founding moment of this alliance, and together with Turkey. But in Greece, joining NATO when it was founded in the beginning of the Cold War also, it was connected, tied of the so-called Truman Doctrine that accompanied the US intervention in the Greek Civil War at the end of the 40s of last century. And the Truman Doctrine, Truman was a US president at the time, following Roosevelt. The Truman Doctrine declared that Greece and Turkey, they are the two vital members of NATO, representing the front line of the anti-communist, no so-called war against the Soviet Union and the pro-Soviet regimes of actually existing socialism in the Balkans and the Eastern Europe. We were part from the beginning, both countries, under bourgeois governments of these countries. We are parts of this thing which accumulated disasters after disaster. Let's look first of all what was and what is NATO. It was and still is the military arm of the US-led international imperialist post-war order, with the task to preserve this order, and at the center of this order, the US world hegemony against not only the USSR and the Warsaw Pact as in the past, but above all against the will and the resistance of the peoples in Europe and internationally, their resistance against the political, economic, and military ordeals, sufferings, disasters imposed to us in the name of the so-called Western democracy, and matter of fact, on the benefit of the preservation of the inhuman imperialist world disorder and of US world hegemony. And particularly when this post-war order and US world hegemony started to manifest all the morbid symptoms of their crisis and historical decline. For this reason, when officially the so-called Cold War ended with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the collapse of these European regimes in 1989, 1991, NATO was not dissolved, despite all the reassurances given by the American leaders to the Gorbachev and company. And despite the fact that Warsaw Pact did not exist anymore, the NATO not only continued its existence, but also it expanded its international role. It had to complete the disaster of 1991 by fragmenting and colonizing all the former Soviet space, Eastern Europe, Balkans, as well, and later, in a later stage, China itself. For this reason, if we take the documentary history itself, from February 1992, the Soviet Union officially collapsed at the end of 91, in December 91. So in February 1992, the US Pentagon issued a strategic document supporting the need for to create conditions that never again the Soviet Union could be regenerated against any danger that again the Soviet communist danger threatens the so-called Western democracies and the United States of America. For this reason, from that moment, they took measures to expand eastward. And this eastward expansion of NATO was not just a peaceful diplomatic process, but a very brutal process from the beginning. Don't forget the massacre of the peoples of Yugoslavia. This was the starting point of the process which today leads to this massacre in the heart of Europe, the proxy war in Ukraine. It started from Belgrade to go to Moscow, as at that time, rightly, my party, had stressed. And at that time, we know from first contact with this new reality, that this war and this eastward expansion of NATO did not affect just the lives of the people living in the former Yugoslavia, but all of us. It was a reconfiguration of the world political scene, an attempt for reconfiguration for the interests of imperialism. For this reason, At that time, the Greek people stood in solidarity with the Yugoslavia against NATO, and we are proud that ourselves we had organized a humanitarian mission under the bombs of NATO in Yugoslavia, led by Comrade Katarina, who participates in this meeting as well. We knew that it is something that changed and will change the life of humanity, including the Greek people, the Turkish people, the Balkan peoples, the peoples of the Middle East, Eastern Europe, of all the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, including in Asia and China. So this military arm of a US-led international machine for control and for preservation of a system, the capitalist system, in its decline. For this reason, it was not dissolved after 1991. For this reason, we had the eastward expansion, which reached today its climax, passing through the counter-revolutions in the former Soviet space, the so-called color revolutions, the expansion in 1999 and 2004 of NATO, then the events in 2014, the so-called Euromaidan in Kiev, and the 8 years hybrid war waged against the peoples in Donbass. And now we are in a totally new act of this international tragedy, of which the culprit is NATO. You have to keep in mind that NATO did not only limited itself to an expansion in the eastern part of Europe. In the same period, in the so-called post-Cold War period, it became a very active factor to wage, in the name of the so-called war against terror, the wars against Afghanistan and against Iraq that killed millions of people, and at the same time ended, as you know, to a fiasco, to a debacle of the US forces, both in Iraq as well in Afghanistan, as we saw with the departure in the US troops from Kabul, reminded all of us scenes from Vietnam when the Vietnamese Revolutionary Army could kick the Yankees out of Indochina and Saigon. So, returning back to my country, to Greece, Greece is at the crossroads of all these international geopolitical and geoeconomic contradictions in the Balkans, at the doors of the Middle East, and at the soft underbelly of the former Soviet Union, now the post-Soviet Russia Federation. The implications are enormous for such a small capitalist country like Greece, with its huge, unresolved, always deteriorating economic problems, and the building up of class tensions and more social explosions. And this small country keeps to be dependent from NATO, the European Union imperialist, as well, above all, the United States of America. To become just another part of a war machine for their strategic needs. To see the connection between the internal developments in Greece within the context of the war developments, the military dictatorship in Greece by the coup of 21st of April 1967 took place by Greek colonels tied as an agents of the American CIA And this dictatorship was established by the coup just 2 months before the so-called June 6 Days War of Israel against the Arab countries. It is not just a chance, a coincidence. There are the two events, the movement instigated by the American imperialists and NATO to stop the mounting working class and popular movements in Greece against the monarchy, against all the bourgeois right-wing parties at that time, to 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 to, to keep under control the Greek working class and Greek society, to be able to use the country in the wider context of the struggle going on in the Middle East by the US and the Zionist state against the Arab peoples, including, of course, the Palestinian Arab people who was expropriated from its lands in 1948 during, by the way, of the Greek Civil War. And the time of the Truman Doctrine started to be materialized. So the dictatorship in Greece, the tortures of many, many militants in that period, the concentration camps in Jura and other places established by the CIA Greek colonels show very much what means when NATO speaks that they defend democracy against autocracy. A lie, a big lie of that time and until today, that they wage this proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, and they encircle China by the other extensions of NATO in the Indo-Pacific, like the Quad or the AUKUS, in the name of the defense of democracy against autocracy. They establish one of the most brutal autocracies in Greece, as in Chile and in other countries, just for their international strategic needs to keep in life a corrupt, historically exhausted, barbaric system, the system of capitalism. So we know from the first, we are experience ourselves in our lifetime as well, like myself, what it means to be a NATO bastion in the front line of a very sensitive geopolitical region like which was the Middle East or the former Soviet space. And it is a warning that not only it is not a defender of democracy, NATO, against autocracy, not only that, but it's not a factor of stabilization or of security of any people, including the Finnish people today. On the contrary, we know from our experience that to be a member of NATO means to face attacks against democratic rights for our people, and to be integrated to all kinds of military adventures and aggressions in geostrategical sensitive areas and regions, internationally and in a regional scale. It was not only the military dictatorship in Greece that was established 2 months before the war in the Middle East, the so-called War of 6 Days, but as well there was an upheaval in Greece in November 1973, connected with the so-called Yom Kippur, October 1973 war in the Middle East, again by Israel against the Arab countries. But this time, it was not just a repetition of the 1967 war. Not only because of the military difficulties that the Israeli Zionist army had faced in their campaign, but as well by the resistance of the Arab peoples in general, including by the implementation of the Arab oil embargo, which intensified immensely the world capitalist crisis that followed the collapse of the Bretton Woods systems in 1971. So, and inaugurated in a period of depression, which hit very much Europe and all over the world capitalist economy. And Greece was one of the weakest link of this whole scene. And in November 1973, we had the huge revolt in the Polytechnic University in Athens, where hundreds of young people were killed by the tanks of NATO and the Greek army at the service of NATO. And of course, the destabilization of the whole situation led to a coup within the coup, where the former collaborator of the dictator Papadopoulos, the other dictator Ioannidis, took in charge the military dictatorship and he was one of the most servile tools of NATO and of the American imperialism, and particularly of the Henry Kissinger diplomatic games for the next tragedy that followed. I mean, the coup already mentioned by Sungur, the coup by the Greek junta, and Samson was just their tool, a fascist in Cyprus, well known for his crimes against the Turkish minority community there. So Samson, because that's a tool of the Greek junta in Athens, following the orders of Henry Kissinger of the US Pentagon, because against Makarios, which was the Archbishop, who was a Nasserite kind of leader of the Cyprus island and connected the non-aligned movement, etc., etc. They called him a communist. He was not at all. He was right wing, the bishop. So they overthrow Makarios, and then in this way they created the conditions for the Attila operation by the Turkish army, under the orders, by the way, of the Kemalist party at that time, of the CHP. If I'm not mistaken, it was a Jevita, was a Kemalist. I mean, another defender of democracy against the Islamists. So the same party, which today, if I'm not mistaken, calls for the deportation of the refugees from Syria back at home. These are the Democrats of today, both in America, in Greece or Turkey, or in Finland, by the way, or everywhere. Real democracy, real freedom can be achieved only in the struggle against all these monsters of a dying system, which becomes more dangerous precisely in that. So, despite the fall of the Greek dictatorship in July 1974, and for one period of the exacerbation of the Cyprus crisis in a second wave of invasion, in August 1974, Greece, which was really in a crisis of power at that time, withdrew for a very few period of time from the military wing of NATO in August 1974. The country remained for all the decades after decades a very servile, very faithful member of the NATO war machine. And not only for the Middle East, but also for what we had called, and we analyzed in an article in RedMed, the need of US imperialism to complete the disaster of 1991, to recolonize all this area where previously was what was called actually existing socialism. So Greece is very important for them in two fronts. The one is the Middle East, whereas everybody knows the American troops are in complete disarray or withdraw. But that does not mean that the Middle East is still extremely important in the world geopolitics environment, not only for the energy, for everything. But it is also true that American imperialism, starting with Obama and the so-called pivot to Asia, is in trouble. But it's in trouble also because of the resistance of the Middle East peoples, both in Afghanistan or in Iraq, etc. And despite the Western Islamophobia and hatred against Iran, particularly, we saw that the war against Saddam in Iraq led finally to the strengthening of the Iranian regime, and not the contrary that they had the idea. No, they are. I mean, despite all the warmongering, I mean, what happens now in the heart of Europe, and everybody thinks about that. We have no forget the American debacle in Afghanistan, the same time that the war conflagration in Ukraine started. So Greece, and particularly Crete, the big island in the south of Greece, is one, together with Cyprus, of course, one of the main imperialist base for intervention in the Middle East. The U.S. Military base in Suda is the biggest military base in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Mediterranean itself. In Cyprus, you have U.S. bases and you have the two British bases still there working. Don't forget about that. In a divided and completely hopeless situation in Cyprus now. But still, Cyprus and Crete are bastions of US imperialism for intervention in the Middle East. For Lebanon today, for Syria, of course, as well against Iran, that the fascistoid government in Tel Aviv, don't forget, they make after the Palestinian people the number one enemy for the Zionist state in crisis now, as we see. So there is we'll have much more changes coming in the Middle East and Central Asia. And so Greece and Turkey and Cyprus in one way are very important in this US and NATO strategy, plans and actions from today and the next immediate period. It's not long term. Okay? It's a short term developments that we have to expect. But from the other side, more and more we had this eastward expansion of NATO, and culminating the war now. The US bases in Greece, particularly northern Greece, play an enormous role. Already in Yugoslavia, they had played a role, the Araxos base and others. And today they play also a role for developments that are taking place in Western Balkans, where not only the European Union, but particularly the United States and NATO use Kosovo as a base to complete what remains from the ruins of former Yugoslavia and to subjugate all the Balkans. Because the Balkans, many decades after the end of the war in former Yugoslavia, is in turmoil. It's in a region in a social turmoil that the mass media don't say anything. Our socialist center, Christian Rakowski, was founded during the war in Yugoslavia. And it was a very important new development for us that our contacts and the relations with comrades and forces in the Balkan countries are renewed in that period, because Balkans is not the cemetery that NATO thought that had established after 1999. On the contrary, is in turmoil. Just one example, permit me to say, that when the European Union, Brussels, in the service of NATO orders, gave the order to Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria to import the Ukrainian cereals and to bypass the Black Sea road in this way to the world market. That meant a destruction of the agrarian economies in all these countries that they named before. And even Poland, whose government is the most anti-communist, Russophobic, pro-NATO, etc., they were very much involved in the conflagration in Ukraine. They put a ban to these imports. And even in one country after another of this, in this region, in our region, is the Balkan region, the peasants and other strata revolted. And they recognized that the collapse of the so-called actually existing socialism did not bring an actually existing democracy or a booming economy. On the contrary, Romanian comrades told me that in Iasio, which, by the way, it was the first Greek revolution against the Ottoman Empire by Alexandros Ypsilantis. So in Iasio, NATO made this period, last month, military exercises, destroying even the life of the peasants living there in this area. Where the poor, these farmers went to ask why they were pushed back from their lands they wanted to cultivate, they found American soldiers telling them this is NATO territory. So they understood very well that to call the Eastern Europe and the Balkans a colonized area by the West is not more a metaphor. This, unfortunately, a dear reality. And the struggle against imperialism, it is as well a part of, takes the form of a struggle. It will take more and more the struggle against this new, bizarre colonial chains imposed to these people. And so we have to have this bigger, wider picture to understand where we are. So Greece now, together with Bulgaria and Romania, became the main path to transfer arms of NATO and the US to the Ukrainian forces, even including the Azov Brigade of Nazis. And Alexandroupoli, which is near the border of Turkey, the harbor, it became nearly an American city now. It is population is bigger than the Greek population, and they became a military bastion of US imperialism, not only to secure the path of arming Ukraine, but as well, and this affects also what happens in Turkey, for the control of the Canal, the entry to the Mediterranean from the Bosporus and then the Canal. Okay,
Dardanelles is how it's said in English. Dardanelles.
Okay, that's the Dardanelles. Okay, Dardanelles in Greek too is the same. So, yes, and I finish that. So we are in this very sensitive geographically, and we have our bourgeoisie and the rulers of my country, of our country, are even the most, they can win the championship who is the most servile to NATO and the Americans. I think from the 27 members of the European Union, it is only the Greek government of Kyriakos Mitsotakis who said that Greece is in war with Russia. Nobody said that for diplomatic reasons. But Mitsotakis, who apart from right-wing reactionary, he's an idiot in my opinion, personal, he said that. But at the same time, it is not the dangers of the military adventures that we face and involvement to a war becoming more and more internationalized on the world scale. But even in a more short term, Greece, which is a bankrupt country, where the GDP of our country is 25% lower than when it was before the Eurozone crisis, which means the distractions which can be compared only on the destruction of the Greek economy under the Nazi occupation, the Second World War, to have an idea what it means that. Despite all the arrangements and the memorandum of understanding and the European Union, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, it's a bankrupt country. Nevertheless, the military expenditure of Greece in relation to the GDP is the second within NATO only to the United States of America. It's huge. And all in this is against any social expenditure for health, for education, for social services, for transport. For this reason, we had this tragedy with the crash of the trains. All this abandoned, wages and pensions and jobs are crashed. But nevertheless, our ruined economy is one of the most militarized at that time. And I finish with that because this is relevant for Finland as well. Because while Greece, it is the poorest country in Europe after Bulgaria. Okay, Bulgaria is the last. Then it is Greece from the European Union states, okay, on poverty. 30% of the population is on the poverty line in this European country. So despite that, we have to pay for NATO these exorbitant sums of money. It's the blood of our people for them. And the moment that this same North Atlantic Imperialist War Alliance today push humanity at the brink of the abyss of a nuclear Armageddon. So the struggle to get out from NATO, this prison of death, to kick out the US NATO military bases, to fight against the war drive, are elementary prerequisites for survival and for the right to have a life in dignity, to live free and not as slaves of the imperialist tyrants of this world. Thank you for your attention and sorry